how are we ever going to, say, solve climate change if we don't actually believe in each other? So you could argue that hope is the new cynicism, or that cynicism is out and hope is in. The question is, though, is it going to be fast enough? Because as you know, we don't have much time, so we got to hurry up.
Hallo und herzlich willkommen im Sinneswandel-Podcast. Mein Name ist Marilena Behrens und ich freue mich, euch in der heutigen Episode zu begrüßen. Homo, homini, lupus. Der Mensch ist dem Mensch ein Wolf. Der Philosoph Thomas Hobbes war längst nicht der Einzige, der fest davon überzeugt war, der Mensch sei im Grunde schlecht. Ein im innersten Kern wildes und grausames Wesen. Eines, das stets sein eigenes Interesse voranstellt und im Zweifel sogar bereit ist, andere dafür zu unterdrücken. Ein Homo economicus, das Bild des Eigennutzenmaximierers, das auch heute noch die moderne Welt und Wirtschaft bestimmt. Und natürlich Grund dafür gibt, den Menschen zu zähmen und zu zügeln. Denn wer weiß, was passieren würde, gebe man ihm mehr Freiheit. In Form von Zeit, Homeoffice oder einem bedingungslosen Grundeinkommen zum Beispiel. Doch was, wenn all diese Annahmen falsch wären? Wenn wir gar nicht so übel, sondern gar im Grunde gut wären? Wenn wir, wie es eigentlich auch den Wölfen, die zu Unrecht als Bestien gelten, auf Solidarität gepolt wären? Was würde ein solches, neues, vielleicht sogar realistischeres Menschenbild für unsere Zukunft bedeuten? Diese Frage hat sich auch der niederländische Historiker, Autor und Aktivist Rutger Bregman gestellt und sich, um Antworten zu finden, auf eine lange Reise begeben. Eine Expedition, die ihn unter anderem auf die Osterinseln führte und ihn in seiner Hypothese, der Mensch sei im Grunde gut, bekräftigte. In seinem Buch plädiert Bregman für einen neuen Realismus, der damit beginnt, dass wir vom Guten ausgehen. Nicht, weil wir hoffnungslose, naive Optimisten wären, sondern ganz einfach, weil es, so Bregman, eben realistischer ist. Und weil wir, wenn wir Herausforderungen wie Klimakrise und Pandemien meistern wollen, vermutlich keine andere Chance haben, als an uns selbst zu glauben. Da das Interview auf Englisch ist, findet ihr auf unserer Website sinneswandel.art ein Transkript sowie eine deutsche Übersetzung zum Nachlesen. Bevor wir in das Gespräch einsteigen, möchte ich noch ganz kurz darauf hinweisen, dass ihr uns finanziell unterstützen und damit einen Sinneswandel möglich machen könnt. Denn in die Recherche, Produktion, Schnitt und so weiter stecken wir eine ganze Menge Zeit und Muße. Und natürlich auch Geld. Und damit wir das weiterhin tun können, brauchen wir eure Unterstützung. Unter allen Steady-Fördermitgliedern verlosen wir zudem ein Exemplar von Rutger Bregmans Buch Im Grunde gut. Wie ihr uns unterstützen und teilnehmen könnt, das erfahrt ihr in den Shownotes. Dort habe ich alles verlinkt. Vielen Dank. So my first question for you is, do you think it is more difficult to be an optimist than a pessimist in our current world and time?
I never really like the word optimism because to me it suggests a form of complacency where you say, don't worry, things will turn out to be all right. Just be an optimist. Look at all these wonderful graphs that show that extreme poverty is going down, child mortality is going down, and look at all this extraordinary innovation and technological progress. Things will turn out to be all right. Don't worry about it. And I think that kind of narrative makes people lazy, right? It makes them complacent. Now, the opposite of optimism, pessimism, is maybe also a form of laziness, where especially if pessimism becomes cynicism, then you get into the position where you say, it's pointless anyway. It's things are going downhill. We can't save the world. Let's just enjoy our life while it lasts. So what I like to talk about more is the importance of hope. I think hope is really the right word, and that we should choose hope over both optimism and pessimism, because hope is about the possibility of change. It's the recognition that things can be different, that it doesn't have to be this way, that we can reorganize our society, reorganize our economy, that there's nothing inevitable about the status quo. And this is also why I think that history is the most subversive of all the social sciences, because it shows us again and again and again that things can be different, that there's nothing natural about, the current order of things, about the way we've arranged them right now. If you just, zoom out a little bit and you hear about, taxation in the 50s and the 60s, when we had marginal tax rates for the rich of 80 or 90%, you're like, I thought that was impossible. The economist always told me that the economy would be destroyed if you do that. But actually, we did it in the 50s and the 60s, and we had much more progress and economic growth back then. So that's just an example of how history and hope can liberate us from the present and show us that things can be different.
So if you say that either optimism as well as pessimism makes us kind of lazy, would you then call yourself something like a possibilist? So someone who's not naive, but also not too realistic, saying that you give yourself a little window of dreaming, but with a sense of realism? Yes,
I've always liked that word possibilist, but it works in both directions. So if you look at what's happening in the US, for example, it is hard to imagine for many people, but what we could be looking at is really the breakdown of a whole democratic system. Because, democracy, it doesn't instantly die, it doesn't get this heart attack and then boom, it's gone. It happens gradually, that society gets poisoned, that people abandon the rule of law, and that the distrust just grows and grows and grows. If you would have told Germans in the 1920s, where they would end up in the 1940s, many people wouldn't believe it. They just couldn't believe it. But if you take a lot of small steps, then at the end you've traveled a long distance. Now progress works in the same way. So for many people in the 18th century, it was unimaginable that there would be a day where we would have abolished slavery, implemented a parliamentary democracy, established equal rights for men and women, and would even be thinking about animal rights, right? That would be unimaginable for many of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, even though they were already talking about it. But to really believe that it could happen in practice, that's another thing. So I think that is really important to keep in mind. And again, this is where history helps you, because it helps you to zoom out. Too often, I think we overestimate the amount of change that can happen in the next couple of months or maybe the next few years, but we underestimate the amount of change that can happen in 1 or 2 decades.
And before we start to maybe talk about what kind of change is needed, in your opinion, I would like to ask you something more kind of private. What do you think made you become more of an possibilist / optimist with realism in your life?
So I think my religious upbringing does have something to do with it. My father is a Protestant minister here in the Netherlands, and he's not a dogmatic kind of person. He doesn't say like, "Oh, Jesus died on the cross for your sins, and you should believe this, and you should believe that, and if you don't, you go to hell." He's not that kind of man. But from a very early age, I was brought up with the sense that there are important big questions to ask about life, and that sometimes what we believe can also become true because we believe in it. What sociologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy. When I was around 18 or 19 years old, I was very much obsessed with the question if I should believe in God, yes or no. And back then I was reading these so-called new atheists, people like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, the biologist, who were all talking about how religion is such a bad thing and that it poisons our society, blah, blah, blah. And I was very enamored by that back then. But as I became older, I became more interested not only in the question, what is truth? Is this a fact? Is that a fact? Does God exist? Is there life after death? But also, what would be the effect of us believing in this or in that, right? So the performative power of ideas. And this is something that you especially see with theories of human nature. If we assume that most people are selfish, then we'll create a kind of society where people will behave very selfishly because we'll design everything around it. We'll create schools and democracies and even prisons that will, elicit the worst in people. Now, if you turn that around, if you assume that most people are deep down quite decent, and that we've evolved to work together and to cooperate, and that there's something called survival of the friendliest, for example, then that could actually become true once you assume it. So I'm really interested in both of these sides of how you can look at truth and at ideas. On the one hand, my book is sort of an overview of the latest scientific evidence we have about human nature and about this shift in science that really points in the direction that we are not as bad as we thought we were. But it's also about what can happen if we actually believe it, and that it could even become more true once we implement that idea. And I think that approach might have something to do with sort of this religious upbringing.
So you said that your book is also kind of an analysis about what picture we have written so far about humankind. So, and that's something I found quite interesting when reading your book, Humankind, is that it by no means is only about the good in people. A very large part tells of the opposite, of violence, wars, mass murders. And to me, it seems that there's far more evidence of all humans' cruelty than of the good in us. Or is my perception wrong?
Well, this is obviously the irony. If you write a book about human decency, is that you have to go on for hundreds of pages about all the atrocities in world history. There is a certain selection bias, obviously. I mean, historians are mainly interested in wars. Sometimes it seems to be that the study of history is the study of war, and more war. And if there's not a war, then we call it the interbellum, the period in between wars. It's a little bit as with the news, right? The news is mostly about the exceptions, about things that go wrong, corruption, crises, terrorism, etc., etc. And therefore, if you watch a lot of the news, then you might get the impression that most people are selfish and government is corrupt. There's even a term for this. Psychologists talk about the mean world syndrome, where you get this feeling because you watch so much of the news that people are just bad and you become more anxious and depressed. So the news is really a mental health hazard. And sometimes I see a similar mechanism in history, is that people just become depressed because they study history and they don't realize they're actually focusing on a very small part of everything that's happened in sort of the last 300,000 years. I do try to zoom out a little bit. But as you're right, you're absolutely right. I have to reckon with the fact that we're not only one of the most cooperative species in the animal kingdom, we are also clearly the cruelest species. We do horrible things, wars, genocides, ethnic cleansing, you name it, things that other animals wouldn't think of doing. I've never heard of a penguin that says, let's lock up another group of penguins, let's exterminate them all. It's a very human thing to do. And so, as I said, it's one of the ironies of writing a book about human decency, is that you have to reckon with that. And I don't have a simple explanation. I mean, I have a very layered explanation. What I do try to show, though, is that the explanation that has been given for so long is that this is just what people do because they're bad, because we've evolved to be selfish, that is clearly wrong. Actually, very often we do the most horrible things in the name of the good, because we think we're actually helping other people, or at least our own people. We perpetrate atrocities or participate in wars in the name of loyalty and comradeship and friendship. And that's really a dark side of human nature.
So talking about history, the nature of humankind that you are also talking about has been discussed for some time. And a quote in this context that is probably known to many is Homo homini lupus, meaning a man is a wolf to another man, by the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, which you also write about in your book. And he assumed that humans in a natural state are basically like wild beasts that fight each other. and only a strong state in the form of a king, whom he called Leviathan, can bring peace among the people. And why doesn't Hobbes' image of humankind convince you? Why do you think differently?
Well, let's first say something about the wolves, because wolves are actually highly cooperative species, you know? They're really good at working together and caring about each other. So I always thought it was ironical that they're like, oh, wolves are these classic selfish beasts that just want to kill and murder and blah, blah, blah. Well, most biologists would disagree. Now, this view that people are deep down just selfish, or even worse, that deep down we're beasts. It goes back, a long, long time in Western culture. There's a primatologist called Arnold Daois who calls it Veneer Theory, which is this idea that our civilization is only a thin veneer, only a thin layer, and that below that lies raw human nature. That if you remove, civilized life, there's a civil war, for example, or there's a natural disaster and the institutions break down, that then people show who they really are. That deep down they're just beasts and they're just selfish and they start looting and plundering and become very violent. This idea comes back again and again and again. And I think one of the most important examples of it was indeed the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who wrote this book in the 17th century called The Leviathan, where he argued that in the state of nature, in the time where we were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, we were engaging in a so-called war of all against all. And back then, life was supposed to be nasty, brutish, and short, in his words. Now, we were safe from that, according to Hobbes, because at some point we sort of elected a Leviathan, an all-powerful ruler named after a biblical sea monster. And I think the idea here is that that we have to choose, between freedom and security, and that we can't have both. So if you have freedom, then the results are terrible, because if you give people freedom, they misbehave and they show who they really are, which is very nasty. So what you need is to give up your freedom and you get security in return. That's sort of the classic Hobbesian argument, where you say, well, we need hierarchy, we need managers, CEOs, princesses, kings and queens, because they need to control the population. Because if there's no control, then you get anarchy, which is terrible, then you get all these atrocities. So yeah, you could sort of summarize my book as one big argument against Veneer Theory.
So does it surprise you then that right now, during Corona crisis, there's a lot of talking about the possibility of home office, and some companies realize right now that they can give their employees more freedom than they thought? Does this surprise you?
Well, there's obviously a tension here, because it goes both ways. In the first few weeks of the pandemics, Veneer Theory really rose to the surface again, when everyone started talking about, people who are hoarding toilet paper, and people, thinking about how long are we going to be able to do this? I've read quite a few op-eds who said, just a couple of months with this pandemic and civil society will break down. It's funny to read back those pieces now, by the way. But indeed, it's I guess for many employers, it was maybe a bit of a surprise that you can just have your employees at home and, they just continue working. Actually, the problem was in many cases that people work too hard if they work from home, because sort of the difference between your work life and your private life disappears. There's indeed, and this is, I think, a good sign. There's a shift in management philosophy away from the idea that you sort of have to control your workers and give them instructions all the time, and that if you're not around, they don't do anything. There are many, many examples now from companies around the globe who give their employees way more freedom and who rely more on what psychologists call intrinsic motivation. That you want to do something not just for the money or for the status, but because you care about it, because you are curious, because you want to contribute, because you want to help other people, just for the good of the thing itself. Now, obviously, the question is how significant this movement is, and sometimes sort of self-directed teams, or give that you give people the ability to work from home are not that significant, because you basically, give people more freedom to work themselves to death, right? That's often what it means in practice. So you have to be a little bit critical here, but it is an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, so if we have on the one hand this view on humankind that is a little bit like Thomas Hobbes, who thinks that we are, that the nature of humans is like a beast. And then on the other hand, we have the option of humankind being not that bad that we thought of. And one philosopher that could be, his thesis could be described as an antithesis to Hobbes is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. For him, it was precisely the state of our culture and socialization that spoiled humans, and only his actual nature, which is hidden behind a mask, is good, according to Rousseau. But I ask myself, isn't it precisely prosperity that comes through socialization that has led to the fact that we deal more peacefully with one another today and do not permanently kill each other?
Mm-hmm. Well, on the one hand, you're absolutely right that right now we are living in the most peaceful of all times, and probably prosperity has a lot to do with that. We have seen incredible economic growth and improved health around the globe, and that makes it much easier to be peaceful, right? It is interesting, though, that if we go back to the Hobbesian view of the world, where he said that in the state of nature, back when we were nomadic hunter-gatherers, we lived these incredibly violent lives, and we were engaging in a war of all against all. Actually, what archaeologists now think is pretty much the opposite. What they've shown in numerous studies is that war is a relatively recent invention of the last, say, 10,000 years, and that for the biggest part of human history, when we roamed the globe as nomadic hunter-gatherers, we didn't really engage in group violence. Now, obviously, jealousy and aggression and arrogance, these things are as old as humanity itself, or I think you can even see them with animals. So violence is not like a recent invention, but really the atrocities, group violence, genocide, etc., do seem to be quite recent phenomena. So what I see when I look at sort of the history of war or the history of human violence, I see something different than what many others have seen, I think. So for a very long time, we painted history as this march of progress, where we started off as these savages, but then we gradually became more civilized, and we became sedentary, then we invented agriculture, then we moved to cities, then we invented the wheel, and blah blah blah. And every step was a milestone of civilization that we can celebrate. Now, I think that actually the history of civilization is pretty much the opposite of that, where the biggest part of the history of civilization was actually a total disaster. Well, for tens of thousands of years, we lived relatively peaceful lives. We know that nomadic hunter-gatherers are relatively peaceful if you study contemporary nomadic hunter-gatherers, for example. And also, if you look at the archaeological record, there's very little or pretty much no evidence for group violence, for example. We also know that these societies were quite egalitarian, even quite some equality between the sexes. You could even call them proto-feminist, these societies. And people were relatively healthy. So, for example, they didn't have infection diseases like the plague and measles and COVID-19, because these infection diseases are the product of people living too close to their animals, often domesticated animals. Now, at some point, people settled down. They became sedentary and they invented agriculture, which has been called by, for example, the geographer Jared Diamond, the worst mistake in human history. The results of that were just terrible. Life expectancy plummeted. The era of warfare was inaugurated. People became much more tribal. It was much more hierarchy. Kings arose, for example. The era of proto-feminism came to an end. And you got all these infection diseases, which are, most of the infection diseases are relatively recent, from the last 10,000 years. So that was sort of the state of the world for around 10,000 years. If you would get the opportunity to choose, would you want to live as a nomadic hunter-gatherer or as a civilized person? Well, it's better to choose like the nomadic hunter-gatherer, because obviously we have made tremendous progress, but that's only very, very recent. It's really, I'd say globally, it's only the last couple of decades. But only 2 centuries ago, almost everyone globally, of the whole world population was a slave to someone, was a servant, was in some way the subject of some powerful ruler. And that's, if you look at it from a world historical perspective, that's not that long ago, actually.
So if I understand you right, it's neither socialization and what we call progress, modern progress, nor it's like the humankind itself that you see as the evil, but there's like a third way, if I understand you right, in which you would like to draw the picture of humankind. So does it, in your opinion, is there an original human nature that is either good or bad, or is there a third option?
I think that's actually a really interesting and very difficult question to answer. So for a very long time, especially thinkers on the left and people on the left were saying that human nature as such doesn't really exist, that we are more a blank slate. And that everything depends on circumstances, on culture, on power relationships, etc. And that it's even dangerous to talk about human nature. I think one of the reasons for that was that, especially in the 70s, evolutionary anthropology seemed to give us a pretty dark message about what survival of the fittest meant. So back then you had a book like The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. And I guess many people interpreted that in a pretty dark way. That Dawkins said this himself in one of the first editions of his book, where he said that we have to teach people generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. And so then people became afraid that evolutionary anthropology could be used to justify capitalism, where you would say, well, people are just fundamentally selfish, and that's the way it is. Let's get the government out of the way, and let's just, inaugurate the reign of the markets. And that's, I guess, why for a long time it was a bit, people thought it was suspect to talk about human nature. But that has really changed, though. It has really changed. There's been a massive shift in evolutionary anthropology and in biology, where now biologists are arguing that what makes humans special is not that we're so smart or not that we're so powerful or strong or anything. No, it's that we're friendly. They even talk about survival of the friendliest. There is strong evidence which shows that for millennia, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids and so had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. And that this has enabled us to cooperate on a scale that no other animal can. Now, that does still leave a huge amount of room for culture. You could even say that it is in human nature to be cultural, because it is in human nature to learn from one another, to imitate one another, to copy each other. And so it is within us to build different cultures and to build different ways of looking at life, etc. And this is really what you see if you study nomadic hunter-gatherers from around the globe. So on the one hand, you see striking differences in their cultures, the way they see the world, their mythologies, how they look at their, the kind of religions they have, the kind of the how they behave, the relationships, etc. It's all very, very different. on the other hand, there are also striking similarities. So, for example, there's one anthropologist called Christopher Boehm who studied more than 300 nomadic hunter-gatherer groups around the globe and discovered that pretty much all of them have this political system that is quite egalitarian. He calls it a reverse dominance hierarchy, where the group sort of controls the leaders, and it is absolutely important for the leaders to be as humble as possible if they want to stay in power. Right? It's pretty much the opposite of what we have today in many countries. So yeah, it's sort of as I said, it's a complex question, because I do think there is such a thing as human nature. You know, it is within human nature to be curious, to long for connection. That we don't want to be lonely, for example. We want to be part of something bigger, of a group. These are all things that are within us from a very, very early age. But then that still leaves a huge amount of room for different human cultures.
And since you dropped the word capitalism, what I ask myself is also, how do the institutions that we have in our current world and time, what impact do they have on the picture that we have on ourselves? So if I think of the Homo economicus, so the image of humans as self-utility maximizers, that might have an effect on what we think about ourselves and others and how we interact with each other and the world. And in contrast to that, you have the word Homo puppy, which sounds quite cute and domesticated to me. What do you want to express with this word? And is it a contrast to the Homo economicus?
Absolutely. So if you look at the history of this concept of Homo economicus, it's really, really interesting. It's really a theory that obviously comes from the science of economics, but that wasn't really tested empirically for a long time. So economists built a whole cathedral of theories, and they had all kinds of policy prescriptions based on that theory of what humans are really like, right? So we have many laws that are still in effect today, which are basically, still all about this view of human nature. It was only in the year 2000 that an anthropologist, Joseph Hendrick, and his team, and Joseph Hendrick, by the way, is really one of the great anthropologists of our time. He did this fascinating study where he started to do sort of kind of cognitive tests with people from around the globe, farmers, nomadic hunter-gatherers, people who lived in rich cities, etc. And he sort of tried to see whether people behaved according to the standard Homo economicus model, which is, would they be selfish enough? And the funny thing is that he couldn't find people anywhere in the world who behaved in the way that economists said we should behave according to their models and theories. So it didn't really seem to exist. Now, funnily enough, it was a couple of years later that he did manage to find Homo economicus, but it turned out to be a different species. So chimpanzees mostly behave according to the models of economists, but not us humans. So it's pretty funny as well, is that he made the remark that all the theoretical work, it wasn't for nothing. We just applied it to the wrong species. But obviously the tragedy here is that for decades, we've been in the grip of a theory of human nature that is simply wrong. And indeed, we should move to a very different, more realistic, more accurate, more scientific view of who we are. And as you mentioned, one of the most exciting new theories here is the theory of self-domestication. This notion that we as a species have domesticated ourselves, that we have sort of tamed ourselves, that compared to our hominid ancestors, we are the puppies, What wolves are to dogs, that's what we are compared to Neanderthals, right? We are just these creatures who really long for connection and friendship and who want to work together, et cetera, et cetera. And that is not our weakness. No, it's our superpower, because it enables us to cooperate on a scale that no other species in the animal kingdom can do.
But don't you think that maybe the wealth that came along with capitalism, of course, it's not only the wealth, but don't you think that this process has also led to the point that we are today more domesticated and maybe more of a Homo puppy than of a Homo economicus?
Well, obviously, capitalism is a very, very recent phenomenon, at least modern capitalism as we have it now from after the Industrial Revolution. It's like this thing that we only have for 2 centuries. And that obviously hasn't been able to change human nature because evolution doesn't happen that quickly. Evolution can happen quite quickly, so you can see changes in the human genome, for example, that only take a couple of millennia. But 200 years is really nothing. So how should we look at this? It's very strange, right? On the one hand, we've made this incredible progress. As I said, we're richer, we're wealthier, we're healthier than ever. We're very worried, obviously, about this pandemic right now. But again, from a historical perspective, it's just amazing that so quickly scientists have come up with multiple vaccines. Vaccines, by the way, are probably the greatest invention in all of human history, because these pandemics, we've been suffering from them for millennia. And we've all heard about the plague, that killed a third of the population in Europe in the Middle Ages. And now in just a year, we can come up with multiple vaccines. The question is, though, how sustainable all this progress really is. Are we dancing on top of a volcano? That's the real question, because we also know what's happening to the climate, and we know what's happening to species that were in a sixth extinction event. So it's basically the biggest gamble in all of human history. That is what civilization is. And it's simply too early to tell. We don't know yet whether it was a good idea. Maybe we should have just stayed nomadic hunter-gatherers, Neanderthals survived for hundreds of thousands of years by hunting and gathering. So that's pretty. Homo erectus was around for 1 million years. Now maybe we started this experiment that will only last for, I don't know, maybe we're gone in 100 years from now, or in 2 centuries. And then if you zoom out, it was obviously the worst mistake in all of human history.
So what I ask myself is also that in your book, you write that distance leads to a greater willingness to be unscrupulous, like in wars when we shoot bombs from far away. And would you say that globalization has made us more willing to exploit people, for example, those living in the global south? And also another example would be that we as humans have distanced ourselves further from nature, no longer seeing ourselves as part of it, and therefore willing to shamelessly exploit it. That would be a thesis or a thought that I have on it. What do you think about it?
Well, globalization is obviously a very multi-sided phenomenon. You could also argue that it actually has decreased the distance between people, because now, there's something terrible happening in Lebanon, for example, and we all hear about it immediately on the news, right? So that enables us to have more empathy for people who are much farther away from us. But then on the other hand, I absolutely agree that if you look at, for example, global supply chains, this sort of this neoliberal form of globalization has really enabled us to do pretty horrible things without feeling bad about it. So we wear clothes that are implicated in, that are produced in an often a quite criminal way, where child labor is involved or worse. I think this is especially true, by the way, when we look at the way we treat animals. Very few people would still want to eat meat if they would have to see a video of the animal, that they're eating. They couldn't do it. But we have sort of created this system where you don't have to think about it anymore, and you don't really see. Yeah, exactly. You don't really see the the animal anymore. There are some who argue, the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari, for example, he argues that sort of the global meat industry is probably the biggest crime in all of human history. And I think that a really good case can be made for that, because if you just think about the incredible amount of suffering, and if you also think about, the latest science that we have on animal cognition, and that they're basically way smarter and way more sophisticated than we thought for a long time, it's really really terrible to wrap your head around it. Just the scale of the crime.
But wouldn't the solution then be more empathy? If we could put ourselves in other people's shoes, wouldn't that inevitably lead to a more peaceful coexistence that would ultimately have a positive effect on our image of humankind?
Well, the difficulty is that empathy is such a limited emotion, or limited capacity of humans. So again, animals are a good example here. A lot of people love their pets, right? People with pets love their pets, and they would find it a horrible idea, of their dog or their cat being locked up the way we lock up our cows, and being tortured and mistreated and murdered. They find that horrible, right? But they don't have a problem with eating those cows who are treated in such a way. And I think that shows that empathy works like a spotlight. It works like a searchlight. You just focus on the things that are close to you, that are, that sort of emotionally arouse you. Well, what we actually need is maybe a more rational or distant attitude, where we zoom out, right? And we don't let us just be guided by our emotions, by sort of what we feel for those who are close to us, our pets, our friends, our coworkers, our neighbors. But we actually realize that all of humanity deserves our compassion, or maybe all sentient creatures deserve our compassion.
I mean, is this possible with the psychology of our human kind, nature, if I can say that like this?
Well, I'll be honest there. It's hard. It's hard. And in a way, it goes against human nature. So on the one hand, we've evolved to be friendly, to be cooperative, to work together. But the dark side of human nature is obviously our groupish tendencies, our tribal tendencies, is that we tend to think in in-group versus out-group. And you're part of this group, so therefore you don't like the other group. You can already see this with toddlers or babies as young as 1 year old, in different psychological studies, is that there's really something deep within human nature. We have xenophobic tendencies very deep within us. Now, it's not inevitable. There are ways to get around this. Contact really helps. So if people have more diversity in their own lives, if you have more ethnic diversity and say in your institutions, in your schools, then people get used to differences and they become much less xenophobic. And also, if you look at history, we've managed to make quite some progress. Whether we talk about the emancipation of slaves, the abolition of slavery, or also, the way we talk about animals. There's one philosopher called Peter Singer who calls this the expanded circle. Is that over the course of human history, we've broadened our circle, say at the dawn of civilization, we mostly cared about our own tribe, and then expanded to the city, and then to the nation state, and now we have collectives of nation states working together, such as the EU, etc., etc. And now the next step is to expand it to all sentient creatures. So yes, progress is possible, but as I said at the beginning of our conversation, it's not permanent and it's not inevitable. It's something that always has to be guarded and that you should never take for granted.
But what do you think does it take? What do people and society need to drive this paradigm shift, this Sinneswandel forward, to create a nutritious ground for it to thrive?
So you need quite a few things, obviously. You need hope. So you need the belief that things can actually be different. you need also a willingness to go against the status quo. And this is really interesting, actually, is that in the second half of my book, I talk about all those people who try to implement this new view of human nature, in their schools, in the way we do democracy, or in their workplaces. And they want to start off with basically a different view of who we are as a species. Now, what's interesting here is that often these people who do that are a bit different. They have the courage to be disliked in a way. I found that ironical, is that these people who are implementing this Homo puppy view of human nature, they're not really Homo puppies themselves. You see? So after I finished writing Humankind, I've mainly been reading and researching resistance during the Second World War. As you know, a huge percentage of Jews, also in the Netherlands, was taken away and murdered, with many Dutch people being complicit and working with the Nazis. We had one of the highest percentages. So I became really interested in the question: who are the people who resisted? What is sort of their psychological profile? What makes them different from the rest of us? And well, let me tell you one story about a man called Arnold Daois. He was really one of the the main, or one of the most important figures in Dutch resistance. He saved around 350 Jews, including 100 children, at great risk to his own life. And if you look at his biography, what you see is a man who basically had a terrible life up until the Second World War. He didn't fit in society. No one liked him. He got into fights with everyone. He didn't finish his school. He was kicked out. Then he moved to the US, wandered around for 10 years, then was kicked out again as a radical communist. And then the war started, and it was the best period of his life. He built this huge underground network and helped save a lot of Jews, mainly, by the way, by bullying other people and saying, you got to take this Jew, you got to hide this Jew. And if he mainly said, you're not a real Christian if you don't do it. He made people very, very uncomfortable all the time. Then the war ended and his life was a disaster again. He moved to South Africa, lived there for a couple of years, moved like 15 times in only 9 years, ended up in fights with everyone again. And he basically died a bitter, angry man. That was his life. And that fascinates me, is that the kind of person who doesn't work in normal times, turns out to be the hero in extreme times. Now, what does that teach us about courage? About that sometimes we need the courage to be disliked, right? And that really goes against our human nature, because we evolved to be friendly, and we just want to be liked. That is only human nature. We want to be part of a group, right? We hate being lonely. We find that very threatening. But sometimes that's exactly what we need to do, right? That's exactly sort of our moral obligation. And if it is true that we're now moving into an era of climate breakdown, of our democracies being threatened, then maybe we need to be a little bit more like this guy called Arnold Daois. Maybe just 5% more. That we need the courage to be unfriendly and to go against our very human need to be liked and to be part of a group.
So what makes you have the courage, or what helps you to have the courage to be more disliked? I mean, I guess that not everyone liked your book.
Oh, I don't really know if I'm a good example of this. I really don't know, actually. Well, I'm a little bit suspect, because actually my book is doing relatively well. So that's maybe not a good sign, right? Is that, I mean, it's easier to do something if people say, well, it's great what you're doing, right?
Of course. Well, what I meant wasn't that there are probably a lot of people that didn't like your book, but I thought that well, my guess would be that there are some people that don't like the paradigm shift that maybe would come along with a more friendlier perspective of humankind and maybe a world that is more egalitarian, so that there's a resistance.
That's absolutely right. Indeed, a more hopeful view of human nature is downright threatening to those in power, because it means that we can probably do without them, and that we can move to a much more egalitarian democratic society. This is the reason why throughout history, those at the top have advocated cynicism. Cynicism is the greatest gift that you can give to the rich and the powerful. Because if you are a cynic, if people can't be trusted, and we are just selfish deep down, then we need them. Then we need the kings and the queens and the monarchs and the princesses and the CEOs and the managers. Then they need to keep us in check, right? But if we can actually trust each other, then wait a minute, maybe we don't need them. Maybe we can sort of start a revolution, right? And move to a very different kind of society. So I guess that's the reason why those who've advocated a more hopeful view of human nature throughout history have often been persecuted. And I think the anarchists are the best example here, because they really have this classic worldview where they say most people are pretty decent, but power corrupts. Think of the anarchists like Peter Kropotkin, in the 19th century, the Russian prince turned anarchist. Well, he was followed by the Russian secret service around the globe. He really he was in prison because of what he thought. Because these powerful people, they really know what's at stake. If people start trusting each other too much, then that could mean, their power is threatened.
I would actually like, at the end to quote one of the paragraphs of your book, which I find very interesting. So you write, "To believe in the bad in humans is strangely comforting. Actually, we are freed as a result. When most people are bad, resistance and engagement don't make much sense. On the other hand, anyone who claims that humankind is basically good has to think much more intensively about why the evil exists, and therefore has to take the initiative, because then resistance and commitment make sense." So my question now is, do you think that with a fundamentally optimistic image of humankind, we could also better cope with challenges such as climate change or the corona pandemic?
Well, it's not enough, but it's an absolute prerequisite. Absolutely. Because how are we ever going to, say, solve climate change if we don't actually believe in each other? In my book, I tell the story of Easter Island. Easter Island has long been seen as a warning for our modern civilization, because here you had this very remote place, the most remote place in the whole world, where people lived for hundreds of years, but then they started building all these crazy statues, right? People have seen them, of these huge heads. But in order to build all those statues, they had to cut down the trees. And so there was massive deforestation, and then they couldn't produce enough food anymore. Civil war broke out. They became cannibals and destroyed their society. Right? That's a story that for a very long time has been told by people about Easter Island, and seen as a sort of a parable for our future, is that we're doing the same thing. Now, again, what's interesting here is that archaeologists and anthropologists have re-examined the evidence of Easter Island and have actually found something very different. What they found is resilience. Is that, yes, indeed, there was deforestation, probably because of the plague of rats and not because they built so many statues. But that after that, they innovated and they came up with new agricultural practices that actually increased the production of food on the island. Now, this resilience is not inevitable. It's not a given. But again, there are really hopeful signs of that. One of the reasons to be hopeful is to look at, what's been happening in Europe in the past couple of years. Not very long ago, the European Union was a pretty depressing project, right? Back when mainly the Germans and their their sort of, how do you say that? Their little slave, the Netherlands, were bashing the Greeks, right? It was this incredibly crazy period where we're basically saying, you got to pay if your debt, and therefore we're going to increase poverty in your own country, right? I thought it was very, very depressing. And back then, I don't know, I pretty much lost hope about the European project. But so much has changed since that. If you now look at the ambitions, if you look at the climate justice movement of people like Greta Thunberg, that has such a big political effect, and that now actually, I think Europeans are at the forefront in the fight against climate change. And we're not nearly there yet, but if you look at something like the Green Deal, proposed by the European Commission, it's so much more ambitious than anything that, for example, the Americans come up with. I mean, Americans are always very good at giving speeches, and we Germans and we Dutchmen, we're not very good at giving speeches, but we're much better at actually doing something, at being practical. So Germany, for example, has really paid the learning money of the world with the Energiewende. If you look at the huge decline in price of solar energy, I mean, we have Germany to thank for that with these massive investments. Wouldn't have happened without it. If you look at wind energy, wouldn't have happened without Denmark, who's been at the forefront of this for decades. Actually, the windmill that we see most of the time is actually called the Danish design. With these three, how do you call it, propellers. Anyway, there are reasons to be hopeful here. There really are. And I also think that there's now a new generation coming that is so much more progressive and also more highly educated and more diverse than the generations that came before that. So you could argue that hope is the new cynicism, or that cynicism is out and hope is in. The question is, though, is it going to be fast enough? Because as you know, we don't have much time. So we got to hurry up.
I think these are, even though I had one last question, but I think these are very good last words that give hope, hopefully, for engaging ourselves in this paradigm shift and helping each other to make this world a better place. And thank you so much, Rutger, for taking the time for this talk. And I wish you the best.
Thanks. Really enjoyed it.
Vielen Dank auch an euch fürs Zuhören. Wenn das Interview euch gefallen hat, dann teilt es gerne mit Freunden und Bekannten. Und darüber hinaus würden wir uns besonders freuen, wenn ihr unsere Arbeit als Fördermitglieder unterstützt. Das würde uns insofern sehr helfen, damit wir nicht auf Werbung angewiesen sind und zudem alle am Podcast Beteiligten für ihre Zeit und Arbeit, die sie investieren, honorieren können. Supporten könnt ihr uns ganz einfach via Steady oder indem ihr uns einen Betrag eurer Wahl an paypal.me/Sinneswandelpodcast schickt. Alle weiteren Infos findet ihr in den Shownotes. Vielen Dank und bis bald im Sinneswandel-Podcast.